Dr. Siegel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Diana. And please call me Dan.
Okay, then. Your work has literally changed the way we understand children and kids and brains in general. And for me, I love science. Understanding where they are at biologically gives me empowers me to have the right, let's say, expectations and the right, information when it comes to their development. And neuroscience has helped us understand children. Connection is what we say. We always tell parents it matters. Connection matters. Connection to our children, connection to our partner. What does neuroscience say about connection? How important is it for our kids and for our brain, let's say, in a physical matter?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. First of all, thank you for having me. And the connection we have between us, we can use as an example of what we mean by connection in general, and also specifically in terms of the nervous system. So there's a body that is called Diana, there's a body that's called Dan. And so in our connection, it's through the sharing of energy that sometimes has symbolic value called information. So we have energy and information, and it flows, meaning it changes. And in a relationship that's about connection, there's an exchange of energy and information. And so what happens in a parent-child relationship, for example, is that the way the parent provides that kind of communication, how they take in the signals of a child, how they make sense of those signals, how they then respond in a timely and effective manner, knowing that no one ever does it perfectly. Yeah. You can just try to be as present as possible, and that there are disconnections that happen. Mm-hmm. So it's not about perfection, it's about being present. And then what you do is you have your communication, your sharing of energy be as contingent as possible. Contingent means I've made sense of what I've picked up in my signals, and then I respond in a timely and effective manner. So I have to receive what the child's sending, make sense of it, and then respond. And so when those connections happen, because we're social creatures, not because we're just animals, because lizards don't need this as far as we can tell, but mammals do. And humans are very sophisticated social beings, and our children are born very dependent on attachment, the relationship. And so those communications that happen within the attachment relationship actually shape not only how the brain responds in the moment, but then how it grows in either a compromised way where it's not going to be so good, or in a robust, what I call integrated way, and then allows the child to thrive.
What is one way or a few ways, or what would you say is a way for a parent to make sense of the information or like a tip or a trick? Because sometimes us as parents, we take it personal, like the meltdown, the meltdown, the tantrum, and parents can get worked up sometimes, maybe because they also have other stressors from outside. Mm-hmm. What is one way that we can, calm our nervous system before answering to the child?
Yeah. Well, what I find helpful for myself when I was a parent of young children, now my children are in their 30s, and what I find helpful for parents I work with, whether it's in workshops or in therapy, is to let people reflect on the fact that the nervous system has two states it gets into. Okay. So one is a very receptive state, and the other is a reactive state. So receptive state means I'm open, I'm ready to receive without becoming defensive. I'm basically curious about what's going on, open and accepting, and I bring a love and a kindness and a concern to what the interaction is all about. So that's the receptive state. But I also, in the same nervous system, can suddenly enter a reactive state. And there are 5 different things that can happen, maybe even more. One is I fight. I'm going to fight with my child or fight with my partner. The other is flee. I run away, either physically or emotionally. The third is I don't know whether to fight or flee, so I freeze up. Yeah. It takes a lot of energy and I'm temporarily paralyzing myself. The fourth F is to flop or feign death or to faint. So it's a collapse. Different from freeze.
Freeze, yeah.
Very different. It's not a tightening, but I'm totally collapsed in helplessness. And the fifth F is I fawn, and that means I look at who's aggressing me, who's my attacker, and I try to take care of them. So that's a more sophisticated social interaction. The first 4 are deep, very primitive ones. So when we get reactive, then we can't be doing good parenting. So the first step is to know, are you in a receptive state where you can do parenting well, or are you in a reactive state? And then you need to do the steps you're asking about. How do I actually take care of my inner experience so I can go from reactivity to receptivity? And there are ways to do that, like focusing on the breath, sensing the breath in and out for just 3 breaths.
Okay.
So sensing the breath. Another breath practice is make the out breath longer than the in breath. And there's a physiology to why that's important. There's a physiology to why that's important. That allows you to turn on the part of the nervous system. If you think about it in simplistic terms, there's an accelerator and there's a brake. And when you breathe out, you're turning on the brakes. It's called the parasympathetic nervous system. Yeah. So by breathing in for a count of 5, but breathing out for a count of 8, you can really make it slower, right? So you can do this, or there's something called box breathing, where you breathe in and you hold it, which is also the brakes. Hold it, let's say, for 4 seconds in, hold it for 4, out for 4, hold it for 4, in for 4. So it's like a box.
Oh, interesting.
And there, basically, you have 12 brakes to 4 accelerator. So either one, box breathing, or just making the out breath shorter if you don't like to hold your breath. And this can turn more of the brakes on.
I love that. That's amazing. Speaking of perfect parenting and saying that, we do mess up sometimes, right?
Everyone does.
Everyone does.
Well, I met one person who doesn't, but that was its own problems. Right? Too rigid and just not just being emotionally present.
So I was about to ask about perfect parenting, and we all mess it up, as you say sometimes. But I have a lot of parents asking me, "Oh, today I shouted at my child, or I left the room and they got anxious about, leaving it because I just had to clear my mind," and the fear of traumatizing our children. Because also I think on a social level, we are overusing, I believe, the word of trauma and traumatizing our kids. Mm-hmm. Everything can be traumatic for our kids. Not buying a toy, not saying no to some things. What is a traumatic experience for a child, and what does it do? So we can understand if we can label it as a trauma or just as a discomfort to our child.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So the word trauma can be thought of as having a capital T or a small t. So a capital T trauma would be something that would be threatening the life of an individual. So It could be the life of a child, like they're in an accident or someone is hitting them and they could be killed. So that's traumatic to have that kind of life-threatening experience. You could also see someone you care about and their life is being threatened. So that can be overwhelming. Your ability to cope is one way to say what trauma is about. But a small t trauma is also a term in the mental health field we use. So for example, I know a patient whose aunt came to them once and said, "You're looking a little fat," when she was 10.
Oh.
And that one sentence from her aunt stayed with her. And as she grew into an adolescent, she would hear it echoing in her mind. Now, it wasn't life-threatening, so we wouldn't want to call it a capital T trauma. But it totally changed in a negative way her sense of who she was. So she lost confidence in herself. So I think it's fair to say that a small T trauma would be an experience which negatively impacts in a lasting way your experience of who you are.
Interesting. Do you do therapy with children or just
I
parents?
used to, but since the pandemic, I don't have an office like that.
I was wondering if there's a practice here in Romania that parents send their children to therapy, but the parents are not doing therapy themselves because they're thinking, let's fix the child.
Yeah, that's common in the United States.
Okay. Yeah. I was wondering, what are some red flags when you look at children and of different ages that you would think, oh, they do need this therapy, or maybe it's just the parents need more information or not themselves therapy?
No, it's a good question. I, as a child and adolescent and family therapist myself, the way I try to address that question is in my background as a researcher. I do research in the field of attachment, and so I study parent-child relationships. And the field of attachment research has discovered that a child's security or non-security of attachment is a very robust, very strong predictor of how they're going to turn out in terms of the ability to regulate their emotions, regulate their behavior, have meaningful, mutually rewarding relationships with other people, how they're able to meet their intellectual potential. In many ways, the fundamental building blocks of how they thrive. So secure attachment doesn't guarantee mental health, but it's a good place to start, and it's the main thing we as parents can give to our children. So the number one predictor of a child's attachment to us is how we as parents have made sense of our own attachment history. Not how we tell the story to our children, but how we tell the story in the research to a researcher, but how we basically made sense of what happened to me when I was a kid, how did it affect me, and were there times, for example, when I was terrified of my parents? Maybe I was neglected, maybe I was abused, or even more subtly, maybe my parent was drunk and scared me. So it wouldn't be called abuse, but it would still be traumatic. So there's something called developmental trauma, which includes abuse and neglect, but there's also something called disorganized attachment, which people can develop even when they don't have developmental trauma. So it's that disorganized attachment which a parent can carry forward with them in what can be called unresolved trauma or even loss, if someone died in their lives. And what the research has found is the most negatively impactful parenting is when a parent themselves has disorganized attachment history and remains with unresolved trauma and loss. So when I'm a clinician working with a family, I almost always invite the parents to come in for a few sessions. And I do the instrument I'm trained to do, an adult attachment interview with them, so that we can see if there are any leftover pieces from their own childhood that the research would say, if they're unresolved, are going to have a negative impact on their child. Even if it's not the primary cause of what the child's going through, it may be a contributing factor.
Interesting.
So I try to do work with parents, and we've uncovered some very painful things, because if you've been terrified of your own parents, your brain has what's called a biological paradox. One part of the brain says, I need to be safe. I want to go to my attachment figure to protect me, which makes sense as a mammal. Another part of the brain, deeper, says, I'm being threatened. I've got to get away from the source of threat. So if the source of threat is the parent, that can be very disorganizing, if we want to use that word, dysregulating.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, if a child wants ice cream before dinner and a parent says no, I wouldn't call that traumatizing. And even if the child has a meltdown, I wouldn't call it disorganizing. I would say it's setting boundaries. Now, if a parent says no and screams at the child and humiliates them by saying, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard, that could be traumatizing because they're terrifying them. The child was just expressing an inner state. I feel like having ice cream before dinner. Instead, the parent can do this. The child says, I want ice cream before dinner. The parent who's present and in a receptive state says, I want ice cream before dinner too. But if we eat ice cream, there's so much fat and sugar in it, which is okay to eat a little bit of as a dessert maybe. But if we eat it before dinner, our body will say we're not hungry and we won't get the nutrition we need. So we're going to eat our dinner completely, vegetables and proteins and different things from the things we're going to eat. And then do you think you want to have vanilla ice cream or strawberry ice cream? Because that's what we have at home after dinner. What do you think? Oh, let's go for strawberry. Okay, good. Let's eat our whole dinner and then we'll have it together. I can't wait to have the ice cream. Something like that. That's totally different. And I call that yes brain parenting because you've created a yes receptive state in your child and you have not given them the ice cream before dinner.
Yeah. How perfect does our parenting have to be to have a healthy relationship or to build a healthy relationship with our children? Because I said something that kind of it came natural, but I remembered it. People brought it up to me from my speech, which was a little bit in public. And I said that the parent will make more mistakes towards the child than the child would make towards the adult, because the child doesn't have, the ability or capability of reasoning to up to a certain age. They don't have the ability to, make the consequence, to work out the consequence of their actions. But grown-ups have, so they should be able to be more in control. And yet, I have parents who ask, have I broken my child forever? Have I completely destroyed? And I ask myself that question too, because for the first year of my daughter's life, I had a postpartum depression. And I wasn't there as I was for my second. I wasn't able to, I didn't have the space, the ability to do that. And I do carry a guilt with me because of that. So I was wondering at one point how big of a mess that I make of my child and of my relationship with my child.
Such important questions. First of all relationships are what Ed Tronick, the wonderful researcher, calls messy. M-E-S-S-Y, messy. So there is no such thing as a perfect relationship. Even if we have the thought and a model in our mind, a relationship could be perfect, that's not true. They can't be. So that's the first thing, to take a deep breath and say, to be human is to be involved in relationships that are not always going the way ideally we think they should. The second thing to say is that, we can just do the best we can. So we need to let go of a way that we beat up on ourselves by saying, oh, it's our fault, our fault, our fault. But at the same time, we want to say, what happened happened. How can I take responsibility for whatever happened? And so you're absolutely right. An adult has that position in the relationship. It's not symmetric. The child is the more immature one. the parent should be the more mature one, ideally. Now, there's a range, right? So the first thing to say is the connection is sometimes called an attuned connection, where the parent is tuning in to the inner life of the child. Now, that often does not happen, as Edtronics research has shown. So the more important thing is not so much is it happening all the time, but when there's a disconnection, especially when it's with heightened emotions, a reconnection, sometimes called a reparation or a repair, is established. So a child learns, okay, I can be disconnected and it doesn't feel so good. And then my parent, the mature one in this relationship, will come back and make an effort at a reconnection. So it's the repair process that is really what builds resilience in a child. So that's one thing to say. Yeah. Now, in terms of your question about the postpartum depression, there's something called alloparenting. Allo means other, and parenting is the attachment figure. So we evolved as humans to have more than one attachment figure. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know if you feel comfortable answering, but please. Were there other caregivers involved in your daughter's care?
Yeah.
Yeah. So children were built to be like that, to have more than one caregiver. If you told me, no, I didn't believe in that, and even though I was depressed, I insisted my child only be with me, then what the research suggests is there are some pretty significant negative effects on a child who is only with a depressed person. Now, even if that were the case, which it's not, so your child had other attachment figures.
At least two in the house.
Which is good, okay? Because with depression, what the research suggests, and maybe you can say whether this fits with your experience, is the brain, especially in the right hemisphere, is kind of in hibernation mode. Okay. And so when a child sends or a partner sends signals to you of the nonverbal sort, your right hemisphere doesn't really pick them up, doesn't express emotion too much. There's a flatness. Was that what the experience was like?
Yep. And also some anxiety.
And anxiety.
Yeah.
Okay. So in all those ways, that state of not being able to be receptive, being full of anxiety, disconnection, is painful for you. And if you were the only caregiver, that would be a very significant impact on your child's development during that first year of life. Because there were other caregivers, she learned I can have someone attuned to me who responds to my nonverbal signals, who is there for me, who's emotionally present, who can tune into me. So that's great. Now, to be very specific and not to just make this look fine, your daughter may have a feeling about you, not inside of her about herself, but will my mom disappear again? So because she's had other caregivers, she can feel good about herself, which is not so true if someone were only with a depressed parent, and that's no other caregivers. So there may be things that come up, like in going to school or going to sleep or other things, where she feels nervous about whether she can rely on your availability. And do you notice those kinds of things?
Yeah. And my question is, can we rewire those experiences now?
You can.
Is there still a possibility to rewire?
So you might call that an anxious attachment, or some people call it ambivalent attachment, and that can absolutely be rewired. It can also be made sense of. So I don't know have you ever talked to her about your depression?
Not at this point.
Okay. But at some point, she can have a story that makes sense of things. So is she started school yet?
No, she's 5, so...
So when she starts school, if she feels nervous, you can have some dolls playing around, and you can even have a story. Say, there was a time when I wasn't well as your mom, and, I was feeling very, very sad for a long time. And you may feel now when you're going away to school, like you really want to be with me because you're not certain I'm going to be here. But I am over my sadness, and now I'm here. So just know that when you start feeling nervous, it may be because of something that happened when you were 1. less than one even. And you may not be able to remember it in the usual way we remember things,
But
called
your body
explicit
feels
memory,
Yeah.
but your emotions and your body feel it. And that's the story. And that's just the way it is, and we can talk about it and understand it. And by making sense of something that happened, and you can wait till she's a little older, but she's getting old enough to actually be able to tell stories like that.
Yeah.
She can understand, I call it mind sight. She can see her mind, understand what happened in your mind, understand how it affected her, and then she can make sense of that. So she can then see, oh, I see, I'm getting nervous because I'm remembering when there was a time when my mom wasn't there for me. So I want to cling to her. That's what ambivalent attachment is about. I want to cling and hold on because I have her now, but there's a feeling like I might not have her some other time, so I better just hold on to her.
Yeah.
So it can be absolutely rewired. That's the beautiful thing about neuroplasticity, is you can work on that. But telling the story of it at some point may be important to do.
Speaking of changes and of showing the children the real world, there are a lot of cases, growing cases of divorce in families. And I've read the study is that 1 in 3 divorces is in the first 3 years of life of a child, mainly because of the pressure or the changes in dynamics and everything. What does a child or a family or a unit need when they go through such big changes in terms of family dynamics and the way the child perceives it?
Well, that's a really important and big question. So it depends on the age of the children.
Okay.
It depends on what the children have experienced, both in front of them and also may have heard through the walls. It depends on the relationship between the parents. So that's a lot of variables I could go through, but it's a very individualized response. Okay. So what I would say is, in general terms, kids who are younger will tend to feel like things that are happening because of something they did. So that needs to be addressed directly, that this is not anything you did, even though you may feel like it is, it's not. And they need to be reminded of that repeatedly often. The second thing is, younger kids especially may be concerned about who's going to take care of them, and they may seem almost like they don't really care that the parents are getting divorced, but they just want to make sure someone is taking care of them. Especially younger kids can feel that way. So talking about that shouldn't surprise the parents. It should just be something that they offer as a way of making sense of what's going on. And then there's, of course, the biggest issue is the research shows that when parents are hostile toward each other, when parents use children as chess pieces to try to get things from the other divorcing parent, when parents blame the other parent or complain, oh, my life is so terrible because you're your other parent, it puts children in a bind. Like, another thing is if parents use the child as a sounding board to talk to them about how bad the other parent is or how lonely they are, and try to parentify that child. Yeah. So those are all experiences to try to make sure that they do not happen, because that's what makes divorce so painful for kids. It's hard enough already that the family is falling apart, but it's doing that. Now, that being said, if there's a lot of hostility in a married couple and they've tried therapy to resolve their differences, that is also extremely negative for children. So even though there are negative outcomes of divorce, there are also negative outcomes of, hostility inside a family. Yeah.
We find it more and more in even in society, but even in close circles and families, relatives, and it's also sometimes it's hard to explain to your child why maybe auntie and uncle are not together anymore, or different family members. So I would like to change a little bit the subject to attention and attention span in children.
Okay.
Because we have also a growing number of diagnoses of ADHD, ADD, and all types of labels, let's call them. And I was wondering, in terms of also school, I was reading this article of attention span and how society has built schools and how it doesn't fit the biology, let's say, of attention and attention span, the way the society has constructed schools and hour-long sessions. And if you were to redo or recalibrate the way we do schools today, or we teach our children in academic forms, what would you take into consideration?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, children have different temperaments,
Yeah.
which are the underlying tendencies of the nervous system. And kids have naturally different capacities to pay attention. So ideally, a school, it's hard to achieve this in practical terms, but a school would be able to sense into how does this particular child learn best.
Mm-hmm.
So some children do learn by having their hands involved in doing things and actively using their bodies in ways that allow them to learn by doing, not just by listening, by sitting still at a desk. So you can have people who are very intelligent, who just are very bodily oriented. Other people like to learn through ideas and get those concepts, and that's how they like to learn. And they don't like to do things with their hands. So having a topic, let's say history, science, and then having different ways you can master the material, ideally would be how a school would be structured. And they would name people to have these different capacities. So that's a little different from, in my field, in child psychiatry. We've named these disorders, like
Mm-hmm.
attention deficit disorder. And once you call it a disorder, people think it's a pathology. But in the United States, we have at least 10% of boys meet criteria for this. So I don't know if it's really a disorder or if it's just a variation of ways the nervous system can be. So some people, for example, have proposed that historically we needed a wide array of how the brain developed, so that if we lived in a village, for example, you would take a person whose temperament was that they like to shift their attention very frequently. You'd put them on the periphery of the village, so they'd be watching all around for any attackers, and they would be fantastic. You wouldn't want to put me there, because I would probably see a rock and I would probably study the rock and think about the rock, and the attackers would just walk by. So there are different roles for different temperaments. School ideally should be structured around different ways of learning and not pathologize that.
Yeah. Speaking of temperaments,
Yeah.
I know that temperaments are not genetically established, right?
Maybe a little bit genetic, but not necessarily
as much as we think.
Right.
Because we some people think it comes as a stamp, and you're born with a temperament, and that's who you are. Can temperament influence how is it for children to manage impulse control, or to be able to be different type of learners, or to connect in different ways to people? How much is it nurture? How much is it nature?
So it's always nature and nurture. So let's not try to compare them too much. And you can have something called inborn, which is not genetic, but that is persistent across a lifespan.
Okay.
So temperament, some people feel, does stay with you throughout your lifespan. Now, you can have aspects of temperament that look like they're related to attention. For example, in a model that I've been working on for about 20 years, we see, as the researcher Mary Helen Imordino-Yang also found in brain studies, that parts of the brain, deep in the brain, that are probably developed in utero will have this individual tend to look outward, not inward so much. Other individuals look inward, not so much outward. Other individuals sort of go in between inward, outward, inward, outward. And that may be a temperament feature. So I could ask you where you are. For me, I'm in toggling. We call it dyadic, for a tension between inward and outward. But other people I know are absolutely outward, and it takes a lot of effort for them to look inward. And other people the other way around. So that may be a feature of temperament. Impulse regulation looks like it's a learned feature.
Skill.
Yeah, it's a learned skill, so that the higher parts of the brain, so if you take a hand model of the brain like this would be the learning cortex where you reflect on things. This would be the emotional learning limbic area. And then your brain stem is developed in utero, in the womb. Some is shaped by genetics, but some is just random events that determine how these networks grow. This is probably where temperament is lodged.
Okay.
But you have the learning limbic area and the learning cortex, and that's where you learn to regulate your impulses. So we have all sorts of studies to show that your attachment experiences teach your brain how to basically take an impulse coming from the lower areas and hold it in check, to stop it. And that's a learned acquisition. Yeah. So now, some people say in attention deficit disorder, it's a disorder of the brain that is not learned from experience. That's how the theory goes. And that it's just something you've genetically acquired, that these areas don't function so well to inhibit impulses. That's what the clinical appearance is like. That's what some of the researchers say. I don't know, but I know that we did take people with attention deficit troubles. We taught them to meditate, and we got better improvements in their overall impulse control and the ability to sustain attention with attention training of just focusing on the breath than if they had been taking medications.
All right.
Yeah. So it looks like those are learnable, even if people call them disorders. You might be able to actually use mind training techniques to develop impulse control.
That's interesting, because I'm doing my master's now in neuroscience and psychology of mental health at King's University. And one of the modules I had is mindfulness. And
Great.
I was a little bit surprised, because I would have expected only, medical, let's say, kind of applied science. But to me, it was a pleasant surprise to see something also that becomes, in a way, commercial. Mindfulness and all the yoga practices, I think they're incredibly good for us. But at the same time, it can be, because of social media and because of the media exposure, a little bit commercialized. And the way we teach our children to do the breath work, the breathing work, it works for some children, and it's easier for some children. But for some children, it seems like is a technique that goes up. You go up against the wall, because their brain maybe is not there yet to be able to do the practice. And would modeling be there, be a best choice in terms of for those children who are not there yet, as in us to do that practice in front of them and model it? Or would you rather say there are other techniques that we maybe should focus on because they're not receptive to doing breath work?
There's some wonderful research that addresses that great question. And in the Consortium of Academic Social Emotional Learning, called CASEL, in the United States, they have accredited certain interventions at different levels of school that have been shown to teach kids how to regulate their emotions, how to engage in relationships that are mutually rewarding, how to improve their attention. So there are programs, for example, like Mind Up, that teach kids what are called brain breaks, which is just to take a break and create a spacious place in the mind that allows you to hold in awareness an impulse and not act on it. So that space between an impulse and an action you can call consciousness. The part of consciousness we're really trying to develop is awareness, the knowing of consciousness. So those are mediated in certain parts of the brain that mindfulness practices have been shown to strengthen. So it may not be the breath that a child responds to, but there are other interventions that you can teach, and when you teach them, basically what you're doing is taking a state of brain firing that a practice in school, let's say, is activating. And when you practice that state repeatedly, the state leads to not only neural firing, but it leads to neural wiring. So I like to say, where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows. So the secret to parenting interventions or even educational interventions is to harness attention, if a child can do that, and you can inspire them to rewire their brain, is the way we like to say it, so that you're inspiring them to do this practice, even if it just takes 60 seconds, and kids who do that develop these, what I call mindsight skills. So in a book I wrote called Brainstorm, you'll see these ways of developing that capacity in adolescence, or a book I wrote called Now Maps teaches pre-adolescents how to do that. And you can look at, all sorts of things in this CASEL, the Consortium of Social Emotional Learning, that basically are teaching these inner practices. There's a practice called ruler, that allows you to have kids become aware of their emotional life, and so they can learn to articulate what they're feeling and to regulate themselves in ways that you might say, oh, how could that child learn to do it? But these are skills that are learnable in school.
How long would you say it takes for the brain to rewire?
Well, there's research that shows in day-long meditation retreats, people are rewiring their brain after one day. But people generally, that's for new connections to be made. For the whole process of making new connections and laying down myelin, it probably takes 2 months, So like when I'm working with patients in therapy, I can see that we're working hard in what's called deep practice, where you're really working on not just the strengths of a person, which is great, but you're working on the things that they're really having trouble with. That's called deep practice. And then that is what is needed to lay down myelin, which is a coil around these connected neurons that allows the communication to be 100 times faster and the resting period to be 30 times slower. So that's 3,000 times more coordinated. When you're laying down a skill, you can actually change the way these neurons are working together 3,000 times better than someone who hasn't had the training. So once you realize those kinds of numbers with myelin, on top of the now newly connected or strengthened synapses, it's a game changer for someone who has a skill. When you watch gymnastics, for example, and you go, oh my God, look at that person doing the gymnastics. And maybe you're a gymnast, I'm not. I go, oh my God, I couldn't do that. It's true. I haven't laid down the myelin in the networks that gymnast has been spending a long time building those expertise skills. Impulse control is one of those. Emotion regulation is another one. Social skills are another one. These are all myelin-based learnable skills. I call them mindsight skills because they each require being aware of your inner mental state, and for social skills, to be aware of the inner mental life of another person.
I would talk about this for hours and hours. I was wondering if there's one idea you would leave the parents and the people who are coming to hear you on stage in just one day, or parents everywhere, what is it one idea that you would like them to know about parenting or about kids, about life in general?
Integration. We haven't talked about it yet, but integration ties everything we've been talking about together. Integration is defined as something in a system allowed to be different from other things in the system. So things in a system being different from each other and then being linked. And in the linkage, you don't impede the different essences of them. So in a relationship, it's where we honor differences and promote linkages. In a brain, it's where different parts of the brain are linked to each other. And so integration, when it happens in a relationship, is called secure attachment.
Yeah.
It cultivates integration in the brain. And when a child develops integration in the brain, they not only have a sense of security, but then they can regulate their attention, their emotion, their behaviors. And when they do that, then they can thrive. Integration is the base of well-being.
When does integration happen? I know it happens throughout stages at different types of a child's life, but when would you say it should be completed? Because we know about
Never. It's always unfolding, even right now between you and me. So it's always in a process of like a river going, and when you don't have it, you go to chaos or rigidity. And so you're always in a flow of developing more integration in your life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything, for your knowledge, for your advice, and for your work.
Thank you, Diana. Great to be here with you. Parenting is one of the most difficult and also most rewarding relationships we can have in our lives. And the thing to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as perfect parenting. You can learn ideas that help guide you, but all parenting is messy. It has disconnections and things you wish you didn't do. We need to know that it may not be our fault, but it is our responsibility to bring this integration into life, which means we want to honor differences between ourselves and our children. And as we cultivate that kind of way of tuning in to what's going on in our child's inner life, we actually are stimulating the growth of integration inside of their nervous system, in their brains. That is what is going to be the neural foundation for well-being as they move on beyond living at home with us and going out into this world. That is the way you can cultivate well-being for your child and even for yourself.